Hey guys, Miss Sewing here. We have our first video lesson in the civil rights movement today. This is going to be a long unit. There is a lot to cover during the civil rights movement, so we are just going to do an introduction today. Here's the topics we're going to cover in the video. We're going to define civil rights. We will discuss the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And then we'll talk about Jim Crow laws, what they were, and how the civil rights movement got started. So we'll start off with a definition so we're all on the same page. If we're talking about civil rights or the civil rights movement, we're talking about a time period during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s where minorities were fighting for equal rights. And the minorities we'll be focusing on are mostly Black Americans, but also Hispanic Americans, gay Americans, members of the LGBTQ community, and women. These four groups of people made significant increases in their rights during this time period. And we can also separate these rights into different categories. We have political rights, like our policies and our laws. We have equal rights in our communities, socially with each other, with other people. And we have economic rights, the right to make the same amount of money or, benefit from the same economic structure. So let's take a look at some examples of past civil rights gains or improvements. We're going to focus on 3 amendments, and all 3 of these amendments can be grouped together because they have to do with the rights, giving rights to formerly enslaved people. So the 13th Amendment is the amendment that bans the institution of slavery in the United States. The 14th Amendment then goes a bit further and gives citizenship to everyone who was born here. And this is important because that includes all those formerly enslaved people. So 13th Amendment says slavery is illegal. The 14th Amendment gives those formerly enslaved people citizenship in America. And finally, the 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote, or the franchise. So notice here it says Black men, Black women, white women, all women did not have the right to vote in the United States until the 1920s. And we'll talk more about that when we get there in class. But these are 3 examples of some improvements made in civil rights during after the period of the Civil War. So just because the Civil War ended and just because those amendments were passed, obviously doesn't mean everything was fine. In fact, during this time period, we have a serious problem, and that problem is segregation. So what segregation means is to separate the races, have certain spaces or things available for white people and other spaces reserved for people of color. And segregation and separation kind of look similar, so it's an easy way of remembering what that word means. And the photo here in the background gives you a good idea of what we're talking about here. We're looking at, to me, looks like a bus station, and there's some signs posted that indicate where white people should be waiting for the bus and where Black people should be waiting for the bus. Just to note, they use the word colored here. We don't use that term any longer. That wouldn't be appropriate. All right, so let's talk about Jim Crow laws. So Jim Crow laws are the laws which enforced or allowed for this type of racial segregation or separation, of having spaces and facilities for Black Americans and spaces for whites. And these are common in the South. And so here's a couple examples of what do I mean by those specific Jim Crow laws. Well, we have things like poll taxes, which we've talked about before in this class, that literal fee, the money that people would have had to pay in order to vote. We have literacy tests, which again were literal quizzes and tests that Black people had to take in order to prove that they were educated enough to vote. These 2 things are now, of course, completely illegal. And of course, the separation of public spaces, like the photograph I just showed you. Those are examples of laws that were put, on the books, passed by local governments, passed by state governments, in order to ensure segregation or separation, and have white people in power above all other types of people. And so we're going to finish up, because I've been talking for a while now, we're going to finish up with how the civil rights movement begins. And there's not really, one event that starts all of this. This is a slow burn of lots of different events and examples. But I do want to share the story of Emmett Till with you, because it is a moment where people start to realize just how brutal Jim Crow segregation was, and how brutal people have been treating each other. And Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy. He was a black boy who was murdered. He was brutally murdered for flirting with a white woman. And it turns out, years later, that woman has admitted that he never flirted with her. He never did anything inappropriate. She just made it up. And he was killed by her husband and some of their friends in the South. And this went to trial. It was, a huge story. And within an hour, the jury decided that the murderers were innocent, and they all got off. None of them went to prison. And it's a horrific story. It's one that continues to be pointed at as kind of a last straw. Here's a beautiful boy who did nothing wrong, who was killed for being black. And it's obviously not an original story, but it is, one that stuck with a lot of people. And we can kind of point to it as one of the examples that really stands out as to when the civil rights movement really gets going and really gets started. All right, guys, that's enough for this video. Remember, you're going to be using this lesson to complete the graphic organizer I provided for you this week. So unlike our notes in the past, where there's a lot more copying of the key points, you got to do the work here. So remember to ask questions if you've got them, but I know that this is something you all can do. And we will continue this in our next video lesson.